Well, still teaching through Matthew, still teaching through section 6 of Matthew, which I have titled, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And this section of Matthew really starts toward the end of chapter 20 and goes all the way through chapter 25. And the theme that really runs throughout most of this, if not all of it, is that theme of pronouncing judgment. This really is the final confrontation of Jesus with the generation of his time, and especially the leaders of Israel, and his last chance to say the ways that they are not following God. And that is what he's largely doing there before his crucifixion. Now, within section 6, we're currently studying what I have called the third portion of that section. And this portion, I've called it the insightful king silences the fools. So this is the portion where you have all these different groups and opponents of Jesus coming to him and asking questions, trying to undermine everything he's doing in some way. And in this portion, we'll see Jesus answer those questions and silence them in so doing, and also show his own insight as he displays his kingship here in Jerusalem. At the end, part of that is his wisdom and his understanding of the things of God. And as of now, we've come to the third question, which is from the Pharisees. And this is the last question that they ask him. The remaining question in this portion is a question that he asks them instead. But this is the last question that they ask him. So let's read chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. It says, "When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" So this third question aimed at Jesus is different from the prior two, mainly because of its greater importance, which is kind of a kind of a difficult claim to make when you're talking about the Word of God, right? How important different parts of it are compared to other parts of it. It is all from God, and especially here in the Gospels, this is all stuff pertaining to Jesus. But I still think this passage here and this question and the answer Jesus gives do qualify as being more important. The prior two questions are about taxation and the resurrection, and those have more to do with the squabbles of various groups of Jews against one another and debates that were very much part of their time and their place. But this third question addresses something that is timeless and universal, which is how to obey God. This is a fundamental question that you're always supposed to be asking yourself, no matter where you live or when you live, and it really is about what priorities God has for you. So regardless of any of the debates of your time and place, this is going to be a topic very much worthy of your thought. And the answer of Jesus is equally timeless and universal, giving us the two chief principles which have, or should have, guided our moral reasoning for the past 2,000 years. In all of this time as Christians, we have never been able to get very far away from these considerations. The first and second most important commandments that Jesus gives to us regarding love for God and love for our neighbors. And for that reason, I've decided to dedicate 5 or 6 messages to this passage. Which of that is true? 5 or 6 is going to depend on some other factors, but a lot of messages on this one particular passage. So get comfortable here in Matthew for a while, because we're not going to leave it for the foreseeable future. Now, for today's message, I plan to cheat a little and preach a variation of a message that I preached once before called Biblical Definitions of Love. I don't know how long ago that was, but it was when we were still in the downtown building that I taught that message, Biblical Definitions of Love. And I decided to teach that message again because I think it's very relevant for what we're doing here. Both of the commandments quoted by Jesus are about love. One of them is love for God, one of them is love for our neighbor. And I suppose, before we get too much into that, we had better remind ourselves of what love is. And that message that I taught all those years ago was very much aimed at that, defining love. It's about biblical definitions of love. And you might also remember that when I taught that message, I framed it mainly around the two greatest commandments, the very commandments that Jesus is discussing here. I very much gave those two commandments pride of place in that message. So here we are again, talking about the two great commandments. So might as well bring back that message and make it the first message in this mini-series that I have planned on this passage. So, very much a repeat, but I think very much in good order and very much relevant for what we're doing. Let me go ahead and give you my outline. My outline has 5 headings, so I'll give these to you so you know what to expect tonight. First, I plan to refute 2 unbiblical definitions of love. So I'm going to begin with things that I do not believe, as I very often do. 2 unbiblical definitions of love. That's my first heading. Secondly, I want to identify the main Hebrew word and the main Greek word that I think are very important for all of this. This is very much a word study, and I built a lot of this back when I did the first message on one Hebrew word and one Greek word that I think are more important than others. So I want to identify those for you. Thirdly, I will discuss 2 biblical definitions of love. So here in the middle of this sermon will be what I actually think is right in terms of defining love, and I have 2 definitions for you. This will be the most important point because I actually tell you what I think is true. And then fourthly, I want to move on from there and discuss love for God in its most basic form, which is not all that I have to say about the greatest commandment, but is at least the very fundamental thing I have to say about the command to love God. And then my 5th heading for tonight is very much the same thing, but pertains to love for other people. So targeting that 2nd commandment that Jesus gives to the Pharisees in this passage, and then just talking about that kind of love in its most basic form. So not at all everything that I have to say on that 2nd commandment, but a lot that I think is very important to say up front. So that's what I'm doing tonight. Now, as I did in my first preaching of this message, I want to remind you that confident obedience depends upon having a confident definition of words that are used in those commandments, right? Unless you know what these commandments mean and what these words mean that Jesus uses, you cannot know that you're actually obeying God. In this case, unless you know what love is, you can't really know for sure that you truly are loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. You might actually be doing those things, but you can't really have confidence in what you're doing unless you know for a fact what the Bible means by some of these words that it uses. And I think that many Christians have a very serious defect of understanding when it comes to understanding love. So that is a problem for their confidence as they seek to obey God, and certainly a problem for their actual obedience. They might be going in a complete wrong direction as well if they don't know for sure what love is. So what I want to do in this message, just like I did in the prior occasion when I taught this message, is be sure we have a confident understanding of what the Bible means when it talks about love, so that we can know how to obey Jesus and know that we are obeying Him as we go about trying to love God and love our neighbors. So that really is the goal for tonight, confident obedience, informed obedience of these commandments. So we're going to start with refuting 2 unbiblical definitions of love. 2 definitions with which I do not agree, but which a great many people talk about anyway, so I want to talk about these up front. And my hope is that this will sharpen our understanding later of the biblical definitions of love. We're just starting off with definition by negation, by saying not this, but this. So we're going to start off with some unbiblical definitions, and I have 2 for you. The first unbiblical definition is a worldly definition. So this is how the people of the world, as opposed to the church, will very often understand love. And I think as they consider love in their own kind of shallow or misguided way, they would describe love as good feeling toward another person. So good feeling. It's a very emotional understanding of love. And most unbelievers, I would think, probably do not get very far away from that very emotional understanding of love. This idea that it's just kind of a good feeling toward another person. To the world, that is probably all that love is, or all that it is in their experience, I would say. Now, the problem with this idea of love as being primarily about good feeling is that feelings are not very reliable. By the very nature of what they are, they come and go. You can feel one way 1 minute and then feel completely differently in the next minute. And that's very much how emotions work. Now, that being the case, if your understanding of love is very much based around emotion, you're not going to have a very solid understanding of love. Your feelings can be strong enough to compel you to do something very great, or can then change to the very next minute and have you acting in a very different way. And when it comes to love, that can be a really difficult thing, because if your understanding of love is very emotional, purely emotional, and that's how you live things out, then your love toward people is going to be very shifty. It's going to be as changeable as your emotions are. And you do see this kind of thing. In the most radical cases, you can see a parent telling his child with tears in his eyes that he loves his child and mean that to some degree, and then the next minute just horribly beat his child. It's just rapidly changing from one emotional state to the next. That kind of thing happens when people in the world are very much enslaved to their sins and aren't living in any way remotely that God would have them live. And if their understanding of love is very emotional, they might never get past that. You can actually say and think that to yourself that it is true, that you love these people, but the way you treat them is going to change rapidly when your emotions change, because your understanding of love is very emotional. And it leads to just a lot of very difficult situations, especially between people. But that's usually very much how it goes when their understanding of love is very much relegated to their emotions. It comes out also in people's dealings with God. They can say, well, I love God. And by that they mean that they have occasional good feelings about God. Maybe when they're in church and people are singing songs and everything is all happy, they're shedding tears of joy about how much they love God. But then they go out from there, and the next thing you know, they're living much like the rest of the world lives, much like people who hate God and just do whatever they want. That kind of thing also happens in terms of a person's relationship with God. If their understanding of love for God is very much an emotional idea of that, it's not really going to have much of an effect on their life. It's going to change as their emotions change. So all of that is what happens if your understanding of love is rooted in just purely an emotional understanding of love, that love is good feeling. That's what happens. Now, in the Bible, and it's very important to say this, in the Bible, love is not simply good feeling. Just because you have good feelings toward another person, that doesn't mean that you love that person. Certainly not the way the Bible talks about it. I want to read from a passage here, and we will come back to this passage a few more times tonight. This is 1 Corinthians 13. This is actually the longest discussion of love that we have in the entire Bible, so it is a rather important passage. I'm sure you'll forgive me for coming back here often. But I want to read a portion of this right now, and I want you to see how strongly Paul connects love with action. So we've been talking about the worldly understanding of love as being primarily emotional, about good feeling toward a person. But for a large chunk of what Paul says here about love, he connects love to action. So not just what you feel, but what you do. So let's read just a few verses from this. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7, part of his explanation of love. Love is patient, love is kind, and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Now, so much of what he says in that snippet of the passage about love, so much of what he says there is connected to action. He talks about patience and kindness, bearing all things. When you're practicing those sorts of things, you're not just feeling a certain thing, you're actually doing things toward other people. You're actually showing them some aspect of your love in what you do. So patience and kindness, bearing all things, not acting unbecomingly, not taking into account a wrong suffered. Those are all things that you do, or at least refrain from doing, as you show love to people. All of that takes love very much beyond emotion. So as you get there in the world and you encounter their understanding of love as this very emotional thing, all about good feeling, what they have there is very far short of what the Bible describes as love. If your understanding of love is just a matter of feeling good towards somebody, that isn't love according to the Bible. And that's one unbiblical definition of love. And it represents an extreme that's way over here on this side, all about emotion. Now let's talk about the other extreme. This is the other unbiblical definition of love that we very often encounter. And this one is unfortunately a Christian unbiblical definition of love. So this is an understanding of love that you encounter among Christians, and you would hope that it would therefore be biblical. Unfortunately, it is not. I think it is very much contrary to the biblical understanding of love. According to many Christians, love is to be defined as good action toward a person. So over here we have this extreme of good feeling toward another person, and over here among Christians we have this understanding of love that's totally composed of good action toward another person. Now, among many Christians, this does seem to be the unquestioned, unexamined assumption about love. It seems that quite a few Christians that I've encountered seem to not even entertain anything else, that love is entirely composed of good action toward another person. They'll just say it even, love is action. They locate love entirely within the actions that they perform toward other people. And in the opinion of those Christians, the idea that love must have an emotional element is just completely wrong. So they've gone completely far away from the other side here. So in the world you see love being entirely emotional, but among many Christians they come over here and say, oh no. Love doesn't need any emotion at all. Any emotional element of love is just unnecessary. Love is entirely about action, according to those Christians. So this seems to be very much an imbalanced overreaction to what we see in the world. And this happens very often. I think quite a few incorrect ideas that Christians have result from an overreaction to things that the world is doing. And I think a lot of Christians have seen the world with its very shallow, emotional understanding of love, and they see that and say, well, I don't want any part in that. I don't want to be that shallow. I don't want to be that shifty in my love. I want to be solid. I want to be absolutely steadfast in my love. So I'm going to make love all about action. What I do. What I do. That's how I'm going to escape the worldly definition of love and have a better definition of love. I'm going to root love entirely in action. That seems to be what has happened among Christians, and it's happened for a long time now and has become very common. But I still think this is an unbiblical understanding of love. I don't think that's right either. I think that also has missed the mark. And to prove that, I want to go once again to 1 Corinthians 13 and read another part of this chapter. Actually, I have two observations from this chapter, both of them showing that love is not merely good action. You can't make that claim and still be biblical. So let's read, first of all, here in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3, and we're going to see that it's possible for a person to perform good actions without love, which I think is a very important point. Let's just see what Paul says here. He says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all of my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Now, Paul's point is that those great actions are worthless without love. That's the whole point he's trying to make there. You can perform all these great actions if you want to, but if you don't have love, they're not worth anything. Now, consider for a moment one of those actions in particular, giving. Paul talks about here about giving all of his possessions to feed the poor. So real self-sacrificial giving right there. Now that would be a very good action toward other people, wouldn't it? I mean, among people here on the earth, to give away all that you have, to feed people that don't have enough, people that are poor, that would be very good. That would be good action. But did you notice that Paul assumes that you could feasibly perform that good action and yet not have love? Because he entertains the possibility that you could do that. He actually says, if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Now that shows you his assumptions about love there, that love actually is somehow more than just good action. If love were entirely composed in things you do, Paul could not say what he says here, right? If love is entirely rooted in good action, then all you got to do is perform those good actions. Just give away your stuff to feed the poor, do this, do that. And that's what it means to love. But Paul says you can do all of those things without love, which tells me that in Paul's mind, love is more than just good action. So what is it then? I mean, what then, in Paul's mind, what is love actually? Well, we can go a little further here and read a portion we've already read in which Paul says that love is defined by attitudes as well as action. Let's keep reading into the portion we already read, verses 4 through 7, where he says again, love is patient, love is kind and not jealous, love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, it is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Many of those descriptions are internal matters. They're not things that you do out here. They're things that you are in here. They are internal. Love is about hoping and rejoicing. Love does not involve arrogance or envy or resentment. But all of those matters are matters of attitude. They're things in here. They're not actions at all. They're internal matters. And for that reason, again, it's simply not biblical to define love as being entirely a matter of how you act. It just doesn't work with what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians 13, which means by the end of this, and just thinking here of just one passage, 1 Corinthians 13, we are at risk of two very unbiblical definitions of love. On one extreme, you have love being defined as good feeling towards somebody, which is what many people in the world would say. But over here you have a lot of Christians going to the opposite extreme, saying love is entirely good action towards somebody. And that also is wrong. Love is neither entirely good feeling, nor is it entirely good action. You cannot make either of those claims and still be biblical. So those are the two extremes that we have to avoid. And hopefully we can shoot a path here down the middle and avoid those extremes and come to a truly biblical definition of love, or more than one, in which we avoid those extremes. And that brings me to the next point, my second heading for tonight. I want to identify the main Hebrew and Greek words for love. Now, I mean, they're like any other language where they have many words that could mean the same basic thing, so I don't want to oversimplify this, but I really do have tonight one Hebrew word or group of words and one Greek word or group of words that I want to talk about tonight here as I talk about defining love. Now I want to go back here to Matthew 22, these great commandments that Jesus gives us. I want to focus my attention as we start. What I'm doing here, this is a word study, okay? This is where you go down and say, okay, it's like, I don't know what this word means. I want to find out what this word means. So I want to go through the Bible, find places where this word is used, see how they use it, and on that basis, define this word. That's the basic idea that we're doing here tonight. This is a word study on love. But we're talking about the Bible here, and we're going back originally to Hebrew and Greek because those were the languages in which Scripture was written. I want to go back to those words just to be as precise as I possibly can. So that's what I'm doing here. Now here in Matthew 22, we have an interesting situation because on the one hand, this is in the New Testament, which was written down in Greek, but Jesus is quoting Old Testament passages which were originally written in Hebrew. So what we have is a Hebrew original that gets translated into Greek in the New Testament. So that's why we have to play both languages here and give some heed to both Hebrew and Greek. Now, just to start here with the Greek side of things, thinking just here in Matthew 22, the word that is translated love here in Matthew 22, the verb is agapao, which is a very common word for love. So this is a verb, this is the action word, this is an action performed by a person or a state in which a person exists, agapao. The noun form is agape, love. I'd be surprised, for those of you that are older, if you've been hanging around for Christians for so long and have never heard agape or agapao, because it's one of the few Greek words that has entered kind of mainstream Christian speech. If they don't know anything about Greek, they at least know this word, agape or agapao. Now that is the word used by Matthew to give the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment for loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. So that's important. So in the two greatest commandments that Jesus says there are, the two greatest commandments that have ever been given, this is the word Matthew uses to give those commandments. Love, agape, agapao. Furthermore, I'll also say this, if you're reading the New Testament and you come upon the word love somewhere, it is most likely a translation of agape or its related words like agapao. There are a few other words for love that get used, so I don't want to oversimplify this, but if you want to gamble what Greek word stands behind your English word love in the New Testament, probably agape or one of its related words. So this is a very important New Testament word, a very important Greek word for understanding love. And my plan is to focus primarily on that word as I do my word study with you tonight. All right, so much for Greek. Let's go to Hebrew now. And of course, this takes us back to the Old Testament. And again, what we're dealing with here, Jesus quotes from the Old Testament. He didn't just make these up. He actually quotes from two Old Testament passages when he gives these two greatest commandments. The greatest commandment about loving God is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and the second greatest commandment is from Leviticus 19, about loving your neighbor as yourself. So all those are from the Old Testament. So we're going to deal with some Hebrew words, and in this case, the same Hebrew word is used. This is the word ahev, which again, that is the verb, so this is the performing an action or existing in a state. Ahev is the verb, and that just means love. Just translated as love, that's what it means. And the related noun is ahava, which again just means love as a noun. So whenever you're reading the Old Testament and you come to these two greatest commandments, that's the Hebrew word group being used, the ahev word group, or ahava. Now, also, very similar as with the New Testament and the Greek side of things, in the Old Testament, if you're reading the Old Testament and you come upon the word love, there is a very good chance it is this word ahev or ahava, to use the noun form. They again have other words that are very often translated love, so I don't want to oversimplify this, but very, very often, if you read the word love in the Old Testament, you're dealing with this group of words, the ahava word group. So that's the Hebrew word that I decided to focus on when I did my word study on these things back in the day. So, all of that to say, we're going to build a biblical definition of love, or more than one if necessary, and we're going to focus on those two words, the Hebrew word that I gave you and the Greek word that I gave you, as they're used in the Bible, to try to define what we mean by love, what the Bible means by love. So all of that, largely background information. I just wanted to tell you what my method was whenever I did a study on this back when I first taught this message. Just so you know what I was doing in my own head as I was doing this word study. Let's get on to the third heading. This is the most important one. This is where I give you what I believe are the two biblical definitions of love. So this is the results of my word study back when I did this several years ago. Now these two definitions that I'm going to give you, they have a common bond. Even though I'm giving you two different biblical definitions of love, they have a lot in common with each other. There's a common bond here. Both definitions occupy a middle ground between the two bad definitions that I gave you earlier. So one of them was all, love is good feeling. The other one is love is good action. Both of the biblical definitions that I plan to give you tonight, they are both a middle ground between those two extremes. So they have this in common at least. It's not entirely emotion. It's not entirely action. It's a mixture of the two. So that's kind of the fundamental difference here between what I'm telling you is the biblical understanding of love and the two wrong extremes that I gave you at the very beginning. So again, two definitions. Both of them I think are biblical. Let's do the first one. The first definition that I want to give you is love as an active delight. These are very short definitions, so you can remember them. Active delight. That's my first biblical definition for love. Now, both parts of that definition are important. First of all, love is delight. There is a kind of joy there, a pleasure in it. This is very different than the Christian definition, which I critiqued at the very beginning. In that definition, love is entirely action, and they'll even tell you that emotion is unnecessary. That is not what we see in the Bible. In the Bible, very often, love does have this strong emotional component, which I have called delight. In Scripture, love is not fundamentally an action at all, but it is something that starts in here. It starts with a delight that you have, a joy that you have in something. Now, I've decided to call this delight an active delight. So I'm not just leaving it there with this emotional component. I'm giving you an action as well, active delight. This delight is strong enough to compel some sort of action. This is the kind of joy that you feel that makes you need to do something. Like you have to do something about it. You have to live it out or else you feel dissatisfied with it. This is an active delight. This makes biblical love very different from the worldly definition that I gave you earlier in this sermon. In a worldly understanding of love, they have this good feeling, but it may not actually play out that way in their actions. It might just be a good feeling in here, and then they go do something else that doesn't look like love at all. Well, in the Bible, love is very often this active delight. Yeah, it starts in here with an emotion, but it's strong enough to compel you to do something about it. It is an active delight. And in this way, this active delight, this love, is a middle ground between the two extremes that I gave you earlier. Now, in both the Old and New Testaments, we see love spoken of in this way. Love is very much described as an active delight in both halves of the Bible. We'll start with the Old Testament, and I have chosen the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, as an example of this active delight. Let me just read what I have here for you. Song of Solomon, Song of Songs rather, chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. He says this, says, "On my bed, night after night, I sought him, whom my soul loves. I sought him, but did not find him. I must arise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I must seek him, whom my soul loves. I sought him, but did not find him. The watchman who made the rounds in the city found me, and I said, have you seen him, whom my soul loves? Scarcely had I left them when I found him, whom my soul loves. I held on to him and would not let him go until I brought him into my mother's house and into the room of her who conceived me." Of course, this is the Song of Songs. This is very much a collection of love songs, so you would expect love to get quite a lot of attention in this particular book of the Bible. And we certainly see in this passage, on the one hand, the delight that this female character has in this man that she loves. I mean, this is a very strong joy that she has. She cannot live without this person. Her delight in him is so strong, in fact, that it compels her to action. In this scene, she's like, this is probably a dream sequence because she describes it as happening on her bed, but she's going around the city trying to find this guy. It's like even as she's asleep in her bed dreaming, she cannot live without this guy. She's got to go find him. So she's out there asking everybody, have you seen him? Have you seen him whom my soul loves? This is an active delight. This is not merely feeling, nor is it merely action. It's both. It's an active delight. That's my Old Testament example, using that Hebrew word that is used in the two great commandments. Now let's talk about a New Testament example using the Greek word that is used in those two great commandments. This example comes from John chapter 12. So this is an example of agape, or agapao, to use the verb form. John chapter 12, verses 42 through 43, in which we see this. This is describing some of the responses that Jesus saw during his ministry. It says, "Nevertheless, even many of the rulers believed in him, but because of the Pharisees they were not confessing him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God." Okay, so here's an example of love. In this case, the object being loved is the approval of men rather than the approval of God. Now, what can it mean for these people to love the praise of others, except that they had some kind of joy in that? They liked it. It was pleasant to them to have the praise of other people. Okay, so there's definitely an emotional component here, but notice that it also compels action. Even to the point where in their minds they sort of agree, yeah, Jesus is saying right things here. I think Jesus is right, but they're not acting on that. They're acting on this delight that they have in the praise of other people. So this is a kind of active delight too. And I chose this example because we very often think of love as a good thing, but it can be a bad thing as well. If you love the wrong thing, it can lead you in the wrong direction. And in this case, their active delight in the praise of men led them away from Jesus. But it's still an example of love, and it's still an example of an active delight. They delighted in the praise of men, and they acted on that delight to the point where they disregarded Jesus and followed the enemies of Jesus instead. So there you have an example of love as an active delight from the New Testament. That gives us an example from both the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's all I really want to give you right now as examples of that active delight. And that is my first biblical definition of love. But I have a second one. A second biblical definition of love. And this definition is another short phrase. This is sincere kindness. So this is my second biblical definition of love for you. Sincere kindness. Now again, both parts of that definition are important. You have to remember both words or you're going to go astray here toward one extreme or the other that I was talking about earlier. First, this form of love is a form of kindness. Right? This is being good to other people. This is in itself an action, right? Kindness is an action that you perform to others very often. In other words, there's still an element of action here in this form of love. This is different from the worldly form of love in which it's entirely good feeling, regardless of how you act. Well, in biblical love, in this definition of love in particular, there has to be an action, the act of kindness. So there's one safeguard against that extreme. Now, on the other side of things, it's not just kindness, it's sincere kindness. It's a kindness that you feel within you, that you actually have within you. This is a kindness arising from your own attitudes and desires within you, which is very different from what the Christians usually say about love. They say, well, love is entirely action. Well, no. I mean, if that's the case, then a person can have ill motives in their heart and perform the good action and still be considered loving, which is ridiculous according to what we see in Scripture. In Scripture, it has to be a sincere kindness. You have to desire to show kindness to this person. Your motives have to be pure. You have to want to show kindness to these people, which means there's an inside component to this too. There is kindness in your heart that comes out as kindness in your actions. It's a sincere kindness. It's real. It's not dishonest. So again, with this sincere kindness, we have a middle ground between the purely good feeling understanding of love that the world has and the purely good action understanding of love that many Christians have. We're shooting down the middle here with sincere kindness, in which you do have this emotional ingredient to it, but you also have this active ingredient to it as well. In this case, it's a sincere kindness. It is a kindness that you perform, but that you feel within you as well. It's a real, genuine kindness. Now, again, I want to give you some biblical examples of this, just so you can see that this is how the Bible speaks about love. First example is again from the Old Testament, using the Hebrew word that is also used of the Great Commandments, the ahav word group. So Leviticus 19 is my example here. This is actually the same chapter, I think, if I remember correctly, where we see the second greatest commandment. But Leviticus 19, verses 33 through 34, this is a somewhat different passage, but you'll see the relevance as I read it here. Leviticus 19, verses 33 through 34 says this: "When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself." This is very similar to loving your neighbor as yourself. "For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Okay, so this love, first of all, involves kindness to the sojourner. All right, that's what he says here. It says you're not supposed to do him wrong. Instead, you're supposed to treat him just like the natives among you, just as you would have people treat yourself, right? So this is the opposite of doing wrong. Instead of doing wrong to him, you show kindness to him, right? So here's the kindness side of things. However, it's not merely the action. You should love him as yourself. And of course, the kindness that you would show yourself, the kindness that you would have other people show you, you want it to be sincere. As you are kind to yourself in any way whatsoever, any way that you are good to yourself, you really mean to be. You're genuine in that. You're not dishonest with yourself about being kind to yourself. Well, you should have that kind of kindness toward other people. Just as you show kindness to yourself in any way, you should do that as well toward these other people. It's also motivated by a sense of empathy. You notice the basis of this command: don't treat strangers wrongly, because you also were strangers. You also were sojourners in the land of Egypt. There's a connection there. There's an emotional connection between what this person is experiencing in your country and what you experienced when you were a slave back in Egypt. So there's empathy there. There's a feeling of commonality. That's going to lead not just to a kindness, but to a sincere kindness. It's a kindness that you're going to feel toward these strangers and sojourners there with you in the land. So this, I think, is an example of love as a sincere kindness. Okay, so there's an Old Testament example. Let's do a New Testament example, also using agape, which is again the Greek word used by Jesus as he gives the two great commandments. And for this, we're going to go back once again to 1 Corinthians 13 and just read that passage again. And you'll see that I think especially in this passage, Paul has in mind sincere kindness as he describes this kind of love that he has in mind. 1 Corinthians 13, we're going to read verses 1 through 7, which is all of what we read earlier. We're just going to read it again, and I think you'll see that this is a kind of sincere kindness. It says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and I know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all of my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, does not seek its own, is not provoked, and does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things." Now, we've covered all this ground before, but again, just to say briefly, love does involve kindness. In fact, one of the very words Paul uses there to describe love is that love is kind. But you get that impression from several other descriptions here as well, that there's an action going on here, and that action is kind action towards others. And yet, we saw earlier as well that love is more than just the action. You can have the action and not have love. So you got to have something more than just that action. And what you need are these internal attitudes here. And the things that Paul describes here are very genuine things. They are things that a person actually has within them. They're not just going through the motions of love. They're feeling this within them. There's something within them that actually motivates this kindness that they have toward other people. And for that reason, I consider this passage especially an example of love as sincere kindness toward other people. So those are my two biblical definitions of love that at least I came up with as I was doing my word study on this several years ago. One of them is active delight. The other of them is sincere kindness. And both of those, I think, steer a middle ground between the two extremes that I think are wrong. Both of them have some kind of emotional component. They have also some kind of active component as well, but they're just slightly different from each other in what exactly they mean. So those are my two biblical definitions of love: active delight and sincere kindness. Now, you might be wondering a little bit more what the difference between those two is. So I have active delight here and sincere kindness here. But they're both middle grounds between, all good feeling and all good action. But what is the difference between the two? What makes them two different definitions of love? Well, the way I would say briefly is this. Sincere kindness is what is done to somebody, but active delight is done because of somebody. So sincere kindness is love, and that is love shown to this other person here. There's an object there. But active delight is more like, what's your motivation? It's caused by somebody. Because of your love for this thing, you're propelled into action. So that's how active delight works. But sincere kindness is all about having an object. So that's how I would say that briefly. And I think you'll see that a little bit more when I get into my last two headings. But just to say it briefly, sincere kindness is love to somebody, whereas active delight is love because of somebody. That's how I would say it just briefly. Now, as I go into my last two headings here, number 4 and number 5, I think you'll see more what I mean by this as I talk about the two different kinds of love covered by the two great commandments. Let's start with the first one, which is love toward God. So heading number 4 for my sermon tonight, the Christian's love toward God, I think, is an active delight. Primarily that kind of love, an active delight. Now, I think that mainly because I don't see how it's logically possible for our love toward God to be sincere kindness. Right? I gave you two biblical definitions of love, and as we think about what it means to love God, we've got to ask ourselves, do both of them apply to God, or is it just one of them? Well, as I think about sincere kindness and showing sincere kindness to God, it just doesn't actually seem possible to me to think of our love for God in that way. Let me read you a passage. This is not about love per se, but it is about who God is and what God is. And this is a statement that Paul makes as well. This is Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 25. Paul says this about God. He says, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things." So God doesn't need anything. God can't even properly be served by anyone. As much as we like to speak about serving God, God doesn't need anything. He doesn't actually need your service, and anything that you give him, he gave to you, right? So that's a very fundamental idea about God, God's independence, God's absolute transcendence above everything that's what we're describing here. Now, having read that, I'm skeptical that it's even possible to show sincere kindness to God. Even if you really do mean to, how can you show kindness to a being who does not need anything, does not really have those kinds, that category of thought? I mean, we spend all of our time with people who have needs, and part of love is meeting those needs, helping those people in that way. God doesn't need your help. God doesn't actually need you for anything. How do you show kindness to a being like that? How does that actually work? It seems like to me, just as I think about it, that sincere kindness really isn't part of our love for God. It just doesn't seem logically possible to me. And if that's true, that means that our love for God is pretty well focused on one of those two definitions that I gave you earlier, that one being an active delight. That our love for God is entirely composed of this active delight that we have in God. And I think that is a very good description of our love for God as we experience it. On the one hand, there is this delight. I mean, I think anyone that is actually a Christian, even the kinds of Christians that say love is purely action, I think they know what it's like to delight in the Lord. The whole idea of the joy of the Lord being your strength, all that kind of talk in Scripture that we see from time to time, that's very much there. And yet, we know also that that love cannot remain merely inside of us. That love that we have for God is strong enough to cause us to do something. And this is what I meant by saying that active delight is the love that you have because of somebody. It's because of who God is to us and what God has done for us that we're just filled with this delight in Him and therefore propelled to obey Him, to serve Him, to do this, to do that. I mean, it's a love that compels action. It is an active delight. So it's a joy that we have in the Lord, but it's a joy strong enough to make us do something for the Lord. We might be unable to do any good thing to God, but if we love Him, we will do many good things because of God. Because of who God is for us, we will be propelled into action of some sort. Our love for God seems like an active delight. Now, I do have biblical support for that, which is important because, again, we're talking about biblical definitions of love. And in this case, applying one of these to God, I think we have a passage that's pretty helpful for this. This is John chapter 14. This is something Jesus says. John 14, verses 23 through 24. Okay, I got to find it here. 14, 23 through 24. Okay. Jesus answered and said to him, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." Now, this passage is very helpful for specifying what it means to love God. In this case, it's God the Son. It's Jesus talking primarily about what it means to love Him. But Jesus is divine, so it does count, I think, as we talk about what it means to love God. And we can say a few things based on this passage. For one thing, the love is distinct from the action, isn't it? He said, "Those who love me will do what I command." So there is a distinction there between what the love actually is and the actions that arise from it. So they're not exactly the same thing. It seems like the love itself is primarily something in here. It is this delight that we have in the Lord, I think. This love that we have for Jesus, this joy that we have in Jesus. And yet, we cannot stop there because as Jesus says quite plainly, if you have this love, you do something. There is an action that comes from it. You obey Him, to cite the example that He gives here. So it's not just a delight that stays in here. It's an active delight. It's a love that comes out in your actions. It's a love that compels obedience in this case. So here I think, as we think about this kind of love that Jesus says His people have for Him, it seems like an active delight. It's not kindness being shown to Jesus, but it is an action taken because of Jesus, in this case, because of the delight we have in Him, I think. So I think here we have an example of our love for God being an active delight. That's my argument for that anyway. So this active delight in God is a two-step process. It means, first of all, we must seek to have the right emotion toward God. This thing that the Bible calls the joy of the Lord is very much a part of what it means to love God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind and all of our strength. This is part of it. Now, we delight in things which we consider to be beautiful or majestic or awe-inspiring. That is why we delight in things, because we see those qualities in them. Well, God is all of those things, and the more we realize that God is those things, the more we're going to love God. The more we see Him as being beautiful or majestic or awe-inspiring, the more we're going to have that kind of delight in the Lord. And that's the first step of loving God. The second step is actually being compelled by that delight to do something, to actually act on this delight that we feel for the Lord. Now, a great many fools delight in the Lord. You can have people, sitting there in church singing songs about God, crying tears of joy about it. But what matters is, how do they act when they get out of that church setting? And how are they toward other people? How are they just in their thought life, in their heart life? I mean, does this great swell of delight that they have in God translate into something outside of them? Does it become an active delight? Because that's the second step of loving God. It's not just this delight, it's an active delight. It's a love that causes something. And that, I think, is how we love God. That is the fundamental, basic thing that I would say about this greatest commandment that Jesus gives about loving God. It's some kind of active delight that we have in the Lord. That is the fundamental thing, I would say. Now, there's plenty more to say about that, and I'll spend several messages more saying all of that. But for tonight, that's the one thing I really want to say, that this love for God is an active delight. All right, I have one more heading for tonight. I want to discuss the Christian's love toward other people and what I think this kind of love primarily is. This is, of course, the second greatest commandment about loving your neighbor as yourself. What kind of love is that? Well, in this case, I think we have the exact opposite of our love toward God. Our love toward God was primarily an act of delight. In fact, probably entirely an act of delight. I just don't see how the idea of a sincere kindness can apply to God. Therefore, I said that our love for God must be an active delight. But when it comes to loving people, I feel like we have the exact opposite situation here, because our love toward people is not always and cannot always be an act of delight. Now, I certainly think that it will be there between you and some people. There are certainly some people whom you know and love, and for them you will have an act of delight. I think that is possible and very much should happen. That said, I think the Bible presents several instances of love practiced toward other people which do not include that sense of delight, and certainly not an active delight. Best example is probably love toward enemies. This is a very common part of Jesus' teaching about love, that you should love your enemies. Well, I have yet to meet a person who delights in his enemies. It's hard to delight in somebody who is out to get you at every turn. That is an impossible thing to do. You can't really have delight in a person who is persecuting you, maybe trying to murder you. I mean, that'd be the ultimate form of enemy. But anyone that's just against you, I mean, it's like their role in life is to undermine what you do. You cannot have any kind of delight in that person. So that kind of love just doesn't work in that case. Here's another example, a love for strangers, people that you simply don't know. It seems like an active delight just isn't really feasible in those cases. Consider the parable that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan. And remember, he told that parable. We'll read that parable at some point in this series and study it. But just remember off the top of your head right now, that parable was told as a commentary on the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So we're very much talking about that concept. And the example that Jesus gives us is that Samaritan who finds that guy bloodied in a ditch and tries to help him. Well, when that Samaritan saw that traveler in that ditch, he didn't have this swell of joy toward that man. That's not how that works. What he did, however, experience was a desire to show sincere delight to that traveler. But one thing for sure is he did not have a delight in that man that he found, beaten up by those robbers. That's just not how those kinds of situations work. And yet love very much applies to those situations. That was Jesus' example for how to love your neighbor as yourself. It just doesn't seem like active delight plays a very big part in some of these examples of love that we're supposed to live out. Love toward your enemies, love toward strangers. Active delight just doesn't seem possible there. Therefore, our love for other people is probably meant to be understood primarily as a sincere kindness. We may not be able to delight in our enemies, but Christians have often been able to practice a sincere kindness toward their enemies. It very often leads to the conversion of their enemies because they're so moved by that kind of love that they see displayed by these Christians. But that kind of love is not an act of delight, it's a sincere kindness to them. Also, delighting in strangers may not be possible, and yet sincere kindness towards strangers is very much possible. Just like with the Good Samaritan showing kindness sincerely to that man he found in that ditch one day as he was traveling. Sincere kindness is certainly possible in those kinds of cases. So, in short, if you find yourself with a true desire to help others, even enemies and strangers, then you have learned to love your neighbor as yourself. That is, I think, exactly what Jesus has in mind in this second greatest commandment. What he really wants from you is to show sincere kindness to other people, no matter what. Now, of course, I want to give more scriptural proof for that. So let's think about a biblical character, very famous one. Let's think about Ruth. Going to the book of Ruth, of course. Ruth chapter 4, which is the very end of that book. I apparently didn't mark. No, there it is. All right, great. Ruth chapter 4, verse 15 is where I want to read right now. Really, I think the whole book is a display of this, but I need to read something, so I'm going to read verse 15 out of chapter 4. Now, this is the end of the story. Ruth has married Boaz. They have had a son named Obed, and Obed has been presented to Naomi, and this is what the women say to Naomi at that time. Ruth 4, verse 15 says, "May he also be a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." All right, so the final comment about Ruth in the book of Ruth is that Ruth has this love for Naomi, and a very remarkable kind of love. A love so great that she's better for Naomi than 7 sons would be. All right, so what kind of love then does Ruth have for Naomi? What kind of love does she display? Well, let's remember the prior 4 chapters and all that we know about Ruth. And if you think about those things, if you're familiar with the book of Ruth, I know I can't read it to you, but it's a pretty famous story, so hopefully you have it in your mind somewhat. I think it's primarily sincere kindness. The way that Ruth just acts with regard to Naomi, just doing so many things for her, staying with her after she's widowed, after she's lost her sons, going back with her to her foreign country, working so hard to provide for her, doing all of those things for her. I think it's primarily a form of sincere kindness. You certainly see the kindness. As for the sincerity of it, we can read one more passage, and I'll just ask you, could you say these words and not mean it with the utmost sincerity? The famous pledge that Ruth gave to Naomi here at the beginning of the book. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." I mean, that sounds pretty sincere to me. I mean, she's saying everything she could possibly say on this occasion to convey that she really means this. I mean, even after the other lady turned away and went back to her home country, we don't even remember her name anymore, do we, right? I have to look at the passage to remember what her name is. But Ruth we know. Why? Because of this remarkable love she has for Naomi, which seems to be a kind of sincere kindness, primarily. And she exemplifies that, I think. And I think that is primarily what Jesus has in mind for the second greatest commandment about loving your neighbor as yourself. You know, active delight between people is certainly possible, you know, between friends and spouses and things like that. But I think by and large, for the most part, what Jesus really means, the love that you can always have toward anyone, is a sincere kindness. Even when an active delight is not possible, you can be sincerely kind toward others. And I think that is what Jesus has in mind as he talks about loving your neighbor as yourself. All right. That is all I really wanted to say to you tonight. I'm going to give you a summary of what I said, and then we'll close it down for tonight. I know this message has been very technical. It's been a word study, or at least the results of a word study. And I'm talking about Greek and Hebrew and all that. But let's not forget, the main purpose here is just to figure out what love is so that we can know what it is, so that we can have confidence that we're actually loving people and loving God. So to that end, I did 5 things for you tonight. First of all, I gave you 2 unbiblical definitions of love, and I demonstrated why I think they're unbiblical. One example was just the worldly definition, which views love entirely as being good feeling. And the other unbiblical example is more common among Christians, who view love entirely as good action. And I said both of those are just extremely wrong. They're on opposite ends of a spectrum, but they're both wrong. Secondly, I identified the Hebrew and Greek words, which I think are most important for our discussion. These are the words used by Jesus as he quotes the 2 great commandments from Hebrew, and as Matthew records them in Greek. Those are the words that we were studying. So we have in Hebrew the ahava word group, and in Greek the agape word group. So that was the second thing I said. Thirdly, I gave you my 2 biblical definitions for love, and I tried to give you some biblical support for those. One of them was an active delight, and the other is a sincere kindness. So those are my 2 biblical definitions of love: active delight, sincere kindness. The fourth thing I did was I discussed the Christian's love for God, and I made the argument that I think our love for God is primarily about active delight, perhaps entirely about active delight. It sure seems that way to me as I think about our love for God. And then the fifth and final thing was describing our Christian's love toward other people. And I said the opposite on that it seems like what Jesus really wants from us as we love other people is a sincere kindness toward one another. Active delight would be great, but I think the most we can hope for in a lot of cases is sincere kindness, especially toward our enemies and toward strangers. And that will be especially important as we study more about what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves. But that's later sermons in this little series here. Okay, so all that to say, those are my biblical definitions of love. That's the groundwork for the rest of the study I have planned on these 2 great commandments. When I teach on Sunday, I suppose, what I want to do in my next sermon is I want to describe how these 2 great commandments play their part in the conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees, and what role these 2 great commandments play in the Gospel of Matthew. So tonight we're talking about, love in general. What is it? How does the Bible define it? Next time I want to come squarely back to Matthew 22 and see what is happening in that passage and what Matthew is doing as he writes his Gospel and quotes Jesus talking about these 2 great commandments. That's what I'm going to be doing next time. Are there any questions tonight that you want to ask? I will reserve the right to refer you to later messages if I see fit, but questions are welcome, and also any comments about these things as well.